I guess I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Andrew.
No worries.
Much appreciated. All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking some time to hear me out. And let me talk a little bit about something I'm a little bit passionate about. Just a quick, I don't have a lot of slides. I do have some, so I'm just going to make sure that, actually, let's make sure I'm connected to the network. There we go. Okay, and while that's busy warming up, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So my name is Meyer Swartz. I've been a developer for literally about nearly 20 years now. So I've got a little bit of experience behind my belt. Started out doing a lot of .NET, and then eventually went into a lot of the SharePoint space and did SharePoint from 2003 all the way up until about 2016. And we were at a particular project. I was working with a company. There's actually two old colleagues of mine here. I was working for a company called Oakton, and we were actually in a bit of a problem. We had some dire straits in that the application we were currently working with, which was essentially back an old Angular 1.1 application, was very, very tightly coupled. It was very, very difficult to maintain, very difficult to monitor, and it was full of problems and bugs. So I put my hand up, and essentially I incorporated React, and I got my team, I was the team lead, I got my team to start learning React, and we had a lot of fun doing that, and essentially we turned that project around, and it was a success, and ever since then I've been a big fan of React. So at the moment I'm actually a consultant, and I do a lot of Node.js, but also am also doing .NET Core, but also mostly React. Now let's get started. Okay, so right, so I put together a little bit of a slide presentation. Okay, so we're going to be talking about React. Okay, my name's not on here, but if you're interested, it's Meyer Swartz. Okay. All right, so this is what we're going to be covering. All right, we're going to be covering React basics. We're going to look at something called JSX, which is the new syntax. And a lot of people go, oh God, you've got this HTML stuff mixed with your JavaScript, and they all go, ah! And I'm like, all right, just give it a second, just give it a chance, and we'll actually explain a little bit about why we actually have that concept. We're going to look at creating some simple components, okay? And then we're going to look at creating React classes, and we're going to be looking at the two libraries that come with React, React and React DOM. There are more, and we're going to be sort of touching as to why there are more and how they work. And then we're going to also be looking at the sort of separations of concerns. Okay, so we're going to be doing a little bit of a demo. This is why I love this particular deck. You can do some really cool stuff like this. Okay. So we're going to be doing a little bit of a demo. A lot of the stuff is going to be sort of very fast-paced, but I have enough decent respect for you guys to know that you'll be able to keep up, because you're all devs, and that makes you probably some of the smartest people in the world. So you got to be. I don't know. Maybe you're just silly because you have to put up a lot of stuff you have to put up with. But let's go ahead and actually do it's very demo-centric. So we're going to be doing a lot of demos in this particular thing. But before I start, I just want to get a sort of a gut feel for who uses React. Okay, a couple. Who would like to use React? Wow, that is interesting. Okay, so I'm actually here, right, to basically partake, or basically just disseminate some knowledge about React. I want to show you how it works. I want to show you from the ground up how things actually operate, what it functions, what it does, and I'd like you to walk away. My goal is for you guys to walk away here to be able to consider it for your next platform. If you ever come to that decision of, should we basically use a new technology? What should we basically do? Give it a chance. I'd like to basically show you how easy it is to get components up and running. Okay, I'm not going to dish Angular. I'm not going to dish Backbone. I'm not going to dish Vim or Vue or anything else like that. But I think they're fantastic technologies. Okay, React is also very, very good technology, and we'll discuss what its strengths are. Okay. Okie dokie. So when we basically go to, because this is .NET, right, and we're all interested in .NET, so I don't know if I can bump that up a little bit. When we do something like this, we can say, okay, so we can type in .NET new, and it gives us a whole bunch of different templates, all right, and we can also say over here .NET new React, and React.js, and Redux. You see those two over there. So that basically gives us a .NET template, right? That basically has all the wiring up for React out of the box, okay? And interestingly, if I come here, just going to open up a new one of these. I'll just show you something quickly. Okay, what I want to do is go cd. All right, so if I basically open up a new browser, or a new editor in here. All right, so this is essentially the type of application that it's going to give you. Has anybody explored one of these things before? Yeah. So this is essentially, you can see that essentially the C# controllers in there. You can see, everybody over here, I'm assuming, knows a little bit about model view controller, MVC, ASP.NET, .NET Core, so on and so forth, right? So you can see over here, you've got all the sort of stock standard stuff. You've got your controllers, you've got your views, okay? And then essentially you've got your React stuff over here in your client application, okay? And if we basically compile all this together, if we look at all this together, what we're going to basically be running into is hot module reloading. We're going to look at NPM, we're looking at package managing, we're looking at a whole bunch of stuff, and boy, that's just going to be overwhelming. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this exists. This is going to be a great starting point, but it's not where I want to start right now, because it's not going to help you, right, if I just basically start piling up all the sort of various different stacks of technologies. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just come back to that later, okay? If we get time, I'll basically spin that up. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this instead, okay? And I'm just going to walk you through what I have over here. It's a really, really simple application, okay? It's basically, life starts out with index.html, and that's essentially what the HTML looks like. And you can see I don't have any, I'm not using Webpack, I'm not using any module bundlers, I'm not using anything. This is the simplest kind of application that you can get. It's got 3 links, so it's got 3 packages that it essentially gets from a CDN, which is, hopefully I'm on the internet, which I am. And the first one is called React, and the second one is called React DOM. And within 5 minutes, you'll know why there are 2 packages and what the differences are. And then it essentially also opens up this thing called index.js, right? And index.js is essentially coming over here. And you don't need to worry about this file at all. We'll have a look at it in a minute. But it's not something we're going to concern ourselves with because we're using TypeScript. Okay? So I'm going to be using TypeScript throughout the session. Why? Because I prefer it. Okay? And as well as that, you need a transpiler. You need a transpiler to basically take the JSX syntax, which is essentially, it's not HTML, it's essentially XML, and it's marked up XML, which looks like HTML, and convert it into JavaScript. And we'll have a look at that in a bit more detail in a minute. Okay, so we've got an index.html, an index.tsx, and then essentially we've got this tsconfig.json, which looks like that. And that's everything I need to get this project up and running. I've got these npm packages over here, and if I show you what's actually in the package.json file, which is not here, okay, that's fine. We'll just basically get it back. Essentially, it's running these 2 things here. So let's just go here. All right. So this is essentially going to be on my GitHub page, and it's going to basically show you the walkthrough of what we're going to be doing. So I'm going to install 2 npm packages. Okay, so now we should see a package.json file coming up. Okay, so what have I done? I've basically added the 2 typings. That's it. That's all I've done. So that's going to give me TypeScript IntelliSense for React. Okay. Okay, so we've got the typings. We've got package.json, with the package.json thereof, we've got an index.tsx and an HTML file. That's it. That's all we need. The rest is all just fluff. Okay? Right. And then essentially what we're going to do is we're not going to even run a server. I'm just going to go here and just copy this path. All right. And I'm going to come to this file here. And there it is. So essentially if I run that, I get this page is working. So I can see that my JavaScript is functioning. How did I manage to do that? Well, I just basically have over here TSC watch. So essentially that's just basically compiling my TypeScript on demand. So every time I change my TS file, it's going to go ahead and update it to the new JS file. And that's going to look like that. Okay, cool. So now let's get started with React. We can see that's the setup. I just wanted to take a few minutes just to explain to you. Really simple setup, nothing special about it. All right, so I could probably do a lot of typing, but I think you might get bored. So I've got something else I'm going to do. I was going to basically run a little bit of a script. Yay! All right, cool. So this is my next command. Okay, now essentially what I've done is I've added this thing called React DOM. Okay, React DOM.render. So this is essentially probably the simplest type of React application that you can create. Okay, it's got a little bit of JSX syntax in there. You can see those are the divs over here with a little bit of hello world. Okay, let's go ahead and save this, and then go back to my thing and refresh this page, and we can basically see hello world. Awesome. All right, let's bump up the font so we can actually read it. Everybody see that okay? Yeah? All right, let's go back here. All right, so before we basically get into an explanation of what React DOM is, I'm going to do the next one, okay? All right, so this is essentially the simplest type of component that we can create. It's called a functional component. And essentially, as you can see, this is a functional component. This is essentially a function. If you're used to ES6, who's used to ES6? Who knows ES6? Everybody? If you're not used to ES6, okay, this is essentially just a fancy way of writing a function, okay? As you can think of it as saying const func comp is equal to function blah, 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 blah. It's the same thing, all right? So very similar to sort of Lambda expressions in C#, all right? And over here we can see that we've got this div, hello world, okay? And what's happened is this is now going to say hello world, but essentially it's going to be doing it from the function. All right, so again, if I go here, all right, you can see that that is now hello world instead of hello world exclamation mark. But before we continue, what I'd like to do is I'd like to come into the JS file and just have a look and see what is produced. This is essentially what TypeScript thought of that JSX. And what's interesting is you can see over here, it's taken that div and converted it into this. React, create element, div, null, hello world. All right, where the first argument is the type of tag it is. The second argument is the arguments I'm passing into that tag. Okay, so if I was like an input, I'd say input type text or on click or whatever it is. And the third argument is the children. Okay, the children of that tag. So it's a div, and then I could have child or nested children. And then essentially that would be here. And you can see that in React DOM.render, we have something very similar. All right, this over here is basically saying this is the functional component. All right, and it's doing the same thing, which is basically saying I'm not going to basically pass it any props. Okay, so what the point of this is, what I'm trying to show you here is that JSX, or this XML structure, is nothing more than JavaScript, and that's essentially what it basically boils down to. You can write React code like this, but I would recommend that you use the JSX syntax because this is much, much more declarative. Okay, so now that we understand that JavaScript, that JSX or the React syntax is actually nothing more than JavaScript, let's go have a look and see what it actually produces. So if I come here, I'm just going to basically push that up, and I also can bump this up. There is a way to do that. Hang on. There we go. All right. Let's have a look at the source of this thing. And we want index.tsx. See, that's the source map coming through. So it essentially assumes that everything is hunky-dory, and I can actually put my breakpoints directly on here, which is kind of nice. So if I refresh this page, whoops, that was a mistake. If I refresh this page, and I get that breakpoint over there, okay, let's have a look at what this thing over here actually gives me. So if I have a look at that, all right, just as is, so copy this, paste it here, All right, that's nothing more than just a function, and it'll tell you, look, I'm just a function, and this is essentially what I've actually got inside me. If I actually call it, though, all right, this is what it's going to produce. It's going to produce an object. And this is essentially the secret of what React is. React basically components, right, are JavaScript objects that produce objects. They just produce these plain old JavaScript objects. And if you have a look at them, right, essentially what it is they're saying, this is a type of div. It's got this property with it, and inside the property it's got children called hello world, okay? And that's pretty much it. There are sort of other bits and pieces over there, but those are the most important things, the props and the type. Okay, so let's go ahead and release that breakpoint. So if we come back to our code, okay, and we have a look at this HTML, we can basically have a look, and what we can postulate is the fact that React is a library, all right, that takes declarative XML and converts it into plain old objects. React DOM takes those objects and spits out HTML. That is what React is. If you ever want to know what a definition of React is, that's essentially what it is. Why did they decouple this? Why did they decouple React DOM and React? Quite simply because you could use it for other environments. We've got React Native. We also have React VR for the virtual reality stuff. So they're actually producing, and they have produced, other frameworks that take up these JavaScript objects or these objects and produce other things, right? So, I mean, this is an experiment I did the other day, because essentially it's just XML at the end of the day. All right, I actually did an experiment once where I took a bunch of React stuff, all right, and I was able to spit out an XML file, because XML is nothing more than XML. I mean, sorry, an Excel file. I spat out an Excel file out of all the XML that was produced. So I basically produced my own DOM language that produced this XML. Okay, so you can do that sort of stuff with it, which is kind of cool. All right. So I just want to point out one thing, because now you can see we're kind of mixing this declarative syntax with our JavaScript, and a lot of people sort of immediately go, don't like it because it feels dirty, and we've been based, it's not separation of concerns. It brings me an interesting story, which I absolutely love. Okay, there was a good guy that I know once. He used to collect cameras, okay, and he had somebody working for him once upon a time, and he managed to disassemble all these cameras so that he could clean all the parts, okay, and he had them all laid out there, and he hired this apprentice, and he went to the apprentice and he said, I've just cleaned up all the stuff. I'm not going to have time to pack it all away, all right? Could you please pack it away for me, or just put it away? Okay, and what happened was he came back and he found all the various different boxes, but there were a few more boxes than what he actually left off with, and he was like, okay, why is there more boxes? What the guy had done, not knowing the tools, he'd basically put all the lenses in one box, he put all the films in another box, he put all the shutters in another box, and that's essentially exactly what we've been doing with our code. We've been putting all the CSS in one box. We've been putting all the JavaScript in another box and all the HTML in another box. What React does is essentially we still componentize and we still have the separation of concerns, but we put all the Nikon cameras in one box and we put all the Fujitsu components in another box, which basically means we can assemble a camera. Yeah. So this is essentially the philosophy, and this is how it works out. Okay. So we've now looked at some very basic sort of understandings and concepts of what React is and what React DOM is. Let's move on. All right. So I showed you a functional component. Okay. Now I'm showing you something called a class component. Okay. And a class component, right, must have a render method. That's the one thing it does require. And the render method must return whatever HTML syntax that we want, or this JSX syntax that we want, or a string or null. Okay, so essentially this is essentially the same thing that we had before, except for now it's a class component. There are times where I want to use functions, all right, specifically for very simple little applications or simple little components, but is a lot more power, and we can do a lot more stuff with the class components. We'll get to that a bit later. So if I save this, come back here, and run that, we see the hello world from class. Okay, so this is all still working, which is great. Okay, I haven't even spun up a server, so that's pretty cool. All right. Right, let's go for the next one. Okay, so any questions so far? I'm not typing this out because I want to move at a pace which is not going to bore you guys. Yeah, but you guys following? Yeah.
Where we could put CSS and all that style?
That's fine. That's a good question. All right. So essentially, I could basically. Okay. So remember that I don't have a module bundler here. I'd have to add the CSS class to my HTML, which is not ideal. But if I was using it, but essentially, if I wanted to here, I could just say class. Now check this out. Class. No, it's not giving me IntelliSense. Oh, there it is. Class name. So we call it class name. That's going to give me, and I can put whatever CSS class I wanted to in there. Okay. But why do we call it class name and not class? Okay, this is one of those JSX little funnies, because class in JavaScript is a reserved word. Okay, so that's why we call it class name. However, if you bear with me for a little while longer, all right, I'll show you an example a bit later where we have inline styles. But you can, of course, use classes. Okay, and there's some pretty fancy stuff that's come up with, that people have come up with lately for dynamically creating classes and dynamically using classes with this kind of thing. Okay, so moving on. Windows Z, sorry. I just want to make sure I'm not saving anything, otherwise my script's going to complain to me again. All right, next one. All right, so now what we have, let's just go from the bottom up. All right, so we've basically got React DOM, which we basically know is the thing that's going to take all those objects and convert them into HTML. And it's going to call this thing called class comp. Okay, and class comp is now basically calling two different components. We can see two children in there. So this is over here a parent component. Okay, and inside there we've got a child functional component. And inside there we called a child class component. And the other thing that I'm also demonstrating to you is the fact that we can pass properties through to them. So this is how we pass children. Okay. So over here I'm saying message, and I'm passing message through to here. All right. And coming up here, well, props.message. Okay. So this could be anything I wanted to. If I wanted to call this message XXX, like that, right, I'd have to basically come in here and just call that XXX. So what it'll do is it'll basically take all properties that are on this line, and it'll pass them through as one big solid giant object to this thing here. Okay, and then essentially I could do whatever I wanted to from there. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead again and save this. Oh, just by the way, something very important. You notice these curly braces here? Okay, so the one big thing about React is we don't have this concept of binding. There is no binding, all right? All we have, right, is a single flow from the parent, from the top, all the way straight through to the bottom. All right, it basically just renders once, and we'll see where we can basically do things like updates a bit later. But the beauty about React, the thing I love about it, is that you don't wind up with binding. What are those squiggly brackets? JavaScript. I can put any JavaScript evaluation I wanted to in there, and it would just basically evaluate that at the time. Okay, so that basically means class name is equal to my function, and it'll basically return to me whatever that function returns. So I can evaluate things on the fly. Okay, so this is essentially just JavaScript. And if I wanted to, I could say, let's say for example over here, I could say dot to lower, or to upper, or whatever I wanted to, right? Or compare, or whatever, because it's just JavaScript. No binding syntax. It's just JavaScript. Okay, so coming back here. Oops. One thing I still don't like about this. What am I doing wrong? Okay, next. Oh, all right. Just gonna come in here. Sorry, I got messed up with this thing is catching me off guard. I gotta figure out a better way to do these sort of presentations where you want to basically get a lot of code in. Okay, so there we go. All right. Now, I think we're good now. Okay, so if I save this, go back here, refresh this, All right, so we can see that all those components are now rendering. All right, so hello world from the parent class, message sent to the functional component, message sent to the class component. Okay, so there we are. Now, you notice all these squigglies around? Okay, that's because we're using TypeScript, and TypeScript can do one better than that. So the next thing we're going to basically show you is essentially type definition for TypeScript. Okay, so what I've got over here is I've got this interface over here, which is defining the properties that go through, and at the moment it's just one. It's essentially, oh, wait a minute, that's too far ahead. There, that's it. Okay, so we can see over here we've got the definitions and all those squigglies are gone. All right, so props definition is basically sending through a message, okay? And we basically declare that over here, and that basically tells React what's going on. So if I take that out and I say dot, it'll give me IntelliSense, okay? And the same thing over here. So props is essentially a props definition which just has one message in it of string, and that'll also give me IntelliSense over there. Okay. Cool. Right. Any questions so far? You all happy with that? It's pretty straightforward. Yeah? Well, there's two things that you can do, okay? If you wanted to pass multiple, so let's say, for example, over here, I'll just show this quickly. We'll do this over here on this functional component. Okay, so I can come in here. Let's just do it like this, all right? So I'm using TypeScript, so I may as well just take advantage of that. I'm going to come in here. I've got a message. Let's get another one called, let's say, for example, value, some arbitrary thing. Let's call that a number. And immediately what you'll notice is we're going to get some squigglies over here because this is starting to complain. And over here, if I look at my IntelliSense, I can see value, and I can put whatever I want in there. Let's say 3. And over here, I'll need to do the same thing. No, that's not right. Value, I don't know why it's giving me that, is equal to, let's say 2. And now, if I come to here, let's go ahead and just put another div in here. Okay, so this dot props dot value. Okay, now if I got a lot of properties, okay, and if I basically have this massive object that I want to pass through, I can pass a whole object through and just pass that through as such. But you can also use spread operators over here. So in other words, I can do something like this, my class, okay, whatever that is, or my object, and that's going to pass that whole thing through as individual properties, okay? All right, so we can go ahead and save this and refresh that, and we'll see that 2 come through there. All right, so I'm just going to undo this. All right, and let's move on to the next set. All right. So the next thing I'd like to show you is passing. We saw how properties can be passed down. It's very straightforward. What about passing properties back up? We do that with callbacks. Okay. So here you can basically see over here I've got this input over here, and I've got this onChange event, and it's just a JavaScript callback, right? And that then basically comes into here, where I can then console log that. Okay. So let's give that a try. All right, so over here, I'll need to see the console. Just refresh this. All right, and as I start typing in here, you can see that it's coming through the console. Pretty straightforward, right? Okay. All right, so that's how essentially we pass properties back up. We pass it with callbacks. All right. Anybody got any questions about this type of syntax? It's ES6, so it's just essentially function parameter, basically passing it through. Yeah. All right. Now there is a problem with this kind of thing, right? And you'd like to think that if I was to just capture this variable or capture what was coming through here in a variable, all right, then I'd be able to essentially reutilize that. Well, the thing about React is once it actually renders out to the DOM and basically dumps it out, that's it, it's done. And it does that specifically, right? And there is no binding, and it does that specifically. It forgets what it's done because of efficiency purposes. So essentially, once it's done, it's done. So the question then becomes, right, well, how do I refresh the DOM, or how do I update the DOM, right? We do that with state. So you might be asking yourself, what is state? Okay, state is essentially where the application is at any particular point in time. Now, every single application you've ever done out there, right, whether it was done in Angular or whether it was done in Backbone or C# or whatever, or Razor, has states. And essentially these states transition from one point to the next. Another good definition for state is where you're going to find your bugs. It's your problem children. A static page is not going to give you a lot of issues. It's only when they start going through transitions that states become a problem. So one of the things that React does is it makes state really explicit. You've got to basically say exactly what that state is, and you've got to know what's happening with that state so that it's easy to debug. All right. So let's go to the next one, and we'll have a look at state. Right. So here we've got the same thing that we did before. Okay. So essentially this is just an input, and it's essentially an onChange event. Over here, we've got this state over here. And this is how we declare state. We declare state and we say, we have a state of type message. Notice also over here that I've got this definition in TypeScript that's basically telling me that I have state, which is a message of string. Okay? So let's have a look at this and see what actually happens from a code flow perspective. This will render. Okay? It has a property, which is a callback. And when essentially something in there fires, in other words, when this thing fires, this text event changes, it's going to call that property, okay, and it's going to pass through the value that was typed in that input text box. This will then set the state, whatever it is going to be, and then I've got an H1 over here that will just render that state. Let's have a look at that. Okay. Pretty easy, huh? Anybody getting lost? You can please talk up. If I'm moving too fast, I'm happy to answer questions, whatever. All right, or is it really that simple? Is it cool? Yeah? Yeah? Yeah. Yeah, so essentially what's happening is I added this callback, and when the callback fires, it's going to update the state over here. So if you think about it, every time somebody basically presses a key over here, all right, it's firing this over here, which is then updating the DOM, which is updating the state. So the rule is if I want to re-render my application, or if I want to re-render something, I update state. Okay, state will basically give me a new version of that particular application. Yes? Well, it's not a two-way binding, unless of course you've got it like I've got it, which is essentially doing that. Yeah, kind of. Yes, exactly. But so if I update state, the render method fires again. Yes.
The variable name state, is that coming from the React component?
So state is essentially, yes, that's essentially the property on the React component. Another name for a functionless or a function component is a stateless component. You can't have state within a function component.
That'll just render once,
bang,
bang,
that's it,
done.
done.
So one of the things that we have with classes is we've got state.
Okay. I have multiple properties that I want to save like this, and I can keep on adding all of them to the interface and then maintaining them.
Sure. Yeah. Okay.
Right, next. Okay, so essentially this has got a little bit of everything, okay? I'll just run this for you. I'll just show you what this does. Okay, and then we'll have a look at it. So this is something that probably took me about 10 minutes to put together, or maybe 20. I'll just decrease this over here. So over here, I've basically got some planets, okay, and we'll just basically just scroll through like that. All right, let's have a look at how that actually gets put together. It's pretty straightforward. So over here, I've got a object, right, of planets, and you can see it's a fairly simple object. It's got a name and image, or an array of name and images. Okay, so I'm just going to collapse that. Okay. Then I've got something which I render as a planet component. Okay. And the planet component, right, has got a div, an image, and an h2. A div, image, h2. Yeah. And it's also got a click, which is basically going to call back that particular planet that was passed to it. Okay. Here is the parent component. Oops. Keep on scrolling out. All right, so this is essentially quite interesting because if you have a look at what's going on here, we've got this outer div, right, and I've got this inner div with an inline style. This is essentially just using a flex box, all right? And over here you've got some JavaScript. It's basically saying planets.map. Planets.map is going to return to me an array. An array of what? An array of whatever basically I put inside as a callback. What am I putting inside the callback? The planet component. So essentially, all it's doing is it's looping through those planets and making me a whole bunch of planet components, which it's then basically pushing to the screen. Okay? So I see some guys looking very confused, some guys looking very happy. So whoever here sort of thinks that's pretty cool that we were able to basically do all that functionality in 2 components. Yeah, you thought it was cool, yeah? All right, whoever here is struggling with this? No one? Huh? All right. Oh, the planet component? Okay, well, I'll show you what we can look at, all right? What I'll do is I'll go over to my handy little dandy, oh, I can't do that here because I'm not on a thing. All right, well, if I was on a server, I'd actually have dev tools or components that will basically break it down for me. But this planet component is one of these things, okay? This over here just basically has an outer div, all right? And essentially what we're doing here is we're mapping the planets, and the planets is this object here, okay? So we're mapping through that. We're basically going through a loop, and each time it basically does a loop, all right, what it does is it takes the map, what map does is, oh man, come on. What map does, what the JavaScript function map does, right, is it takes an array and it'll create a callback, which is this thing over here, and each time it creates a callback, right, I get one element out of it. So I get the planet out of, so you know, you can imagine this is basically going through 8 times, and each time I get one planet, and each time I get the planet, I say return to me a planet component, which is that div with the image, and push it into this one.
And you just pass it off.
Yeah, got it? All right, cool. Yes, sorry.
Just a question about updating the state again.
Yeah.
So it renders the DOM again. Doesn't that renders the whole HTML as well, or it only updates the variables inside the HTML?
Very good question. I will answer that in a few minutes. Okay. All right. So I just wanted to give you a breakdown. I know that was a lot of sort of stuff to take in, okay? But that's actually it. That's React. Okay, so then the question can become, what is this Redux and what is this Fiber? What is all these other things that we're hearing about? That is over and above everything we've learned. If you know this, you can actually create React apps. Okay, this is all there is. That's the beauty about it. It's really simple. Okay, but now we're going to be looking at some other sort of little sort of principles, if that's okay with you guys, and then we'll wrap it up. Okay, so when we're looking at, sure, yeah, I'll do that. All right, so this is impossible to read, I know that, okay. But I wanted to just give you the slide and just make it as so that you guys can see what's going on here. All right, so this over here is the component lifecycle. Now, whoever here does old-time ASP.NET? All right, Remember ASP.NET? Now remember we had loading, prior to loading. We had all these different things that would happen, different events. React actually has something like that, which is a little bit similar. And we can catch those things, okay? So I just wanted to show you this quickly. So essentially when we first start out, right, we have a constructor which can get called. I'm talking about the React class now, right? It was React classes that we looked at. All right, then essentially we say component will update, it renders, and then essentially the last thing it does is component did mount. This is an interesting one because essentially this basically tells me that the React component is now sitting in the DOM, and this is now a really good point for me to do any network fetches or basically any calculations or anything else like that. All right, and then once I've done all those calculations, I can update state, and then something else happens. If I state changes, all right, then it goes through this tree. Component will receive props, and this will answer your other question about does it render the whole application? Well, it basically depends on this lifecycle method. Does it return true or false? If it returns false, it won't update, and it won't update its children. Yeah. So you can very easily just put that in there, and it'll basically stop it from rendering. Okay. So if you want to catch things at various different places of the lifecycle, maybe you want to do some cleanup code. Okay. The cleanup code is happening over here. Cleanup, component will unmount. So this is where you can destroy objects or do whatever else you need to do. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going in through this because I mean this could be its own lecture as to how this all works. All right, the one thing if you have a look at a lot of the React code out there, most of it is basically using component did mount because that's essentially the end of the lifecycle, and then we can update state from there. But if you want to do things like checks or basically make things more efficient, you can use the other ones. This is all well documented. So the thing to know, right, is take away from this particular lecture is that there is these lifecycle methods, these hooks, okay? And if we have enough time, then I'll show you one. All right, so next. All right, so this is essentially a bit more than onto that, okay? So I'm just going to play you this little video that I've created over here. All right, so we've got this tree. Now, before I go into this, I just need to explain this. The way that React works is you've got this object which we created from either functional components or from class components. Remember those little plain old objects. And that's sitting in memory, right? And what actually happens is React takes that and pushes it into its memory. Then what happens is something comes along and changes the state, all right? Then what it does is it basically does a diff between these two. And it'll find out what's changed. That's what it writes to the DOM, okay? So if I basically have an empty div, all right, that's the first state. Then I've got hello, does a diff, it says, there's a change there. That's the only thing that it'll update. It won't update the whole tree. It'll update that and its children, okay? Because obviously if there's something in the parents changed, it could basically update its children. So over here we can see like a React top level node and its children, and this has further children, and this has further children. Okay, so you can see how that would work. So just coming back to the beginning over here. So no state, no change, everything is as is, it's idle. Okay, then a change happens. Now we can see that one of those nodes has changed. It does a reconciliation, which basically means it does a diffing, and it'll update it and its children. However, there is a override method, component should update, and then we can change it so that it only doesn't override all of them. In other words, what we can say is, don't bother changing that one, just update the other ones. This is why React has a reputation for being incredibly quick, because it'll only update those particular components or those mounted components in the DOM, and doing a differential or doing what they call a reconciliation, which is a diff between the objects in memory and the objects that you've just updated in memory, not on the DOM, is very, very fast. Okay. Right. But it gets even better because in React 16, which was released a couple of months ago, we've introduced a new concept called React Fiber. This puts React as probably one of the top fastest renderers, or one of the top fastest UI frameworks out there. All right. The reason being is because what they've done is they prioritize the tasks. What this basically means is that if you've got a lot of things happening, there are a lot of DOM nodes that are basically rendering up and down and whatever, okay, and you do a change, like let's say you click or you mouse over or something like that, okay, it needs to calculate the time that it's going to take to do that. Now, there's two ways it can do it. It can either basically finish its one cycle of, I'm going to basically show all these frames, and then I'm going to click. Or it can basically say, all right, I've got to click and I've got to render. Which one's more important? Let's render, because if I have to wait another 100 milliseconds for that click event to happen, the user's not going to notice. So it's a prioritization of everything that's happening in the DOM. And that's essentially what Fiber is. Now, I've got a bit of an example over here. So this is essentially using, this is 1,000 nodes on the actual DOM, okay? And it's using the original stuff, all right? That's everything we've discussed, all right? It's updating everything. It's basically updating all the various different numbers. It's also basically pushing, and I can also hover over. And you'll notice that this sort of hover is giving you a bad experience, okay? React 16, and still, React was considered one of the fastest frameworks prior to this. Now, with Fiber, it looks like this. All right, same thread, because we only have a single thread in the DOM. Okay, the only difference is the prioritization of tasks. Everything else works the same. Okay, all right. So that pretty much brings me everything I wanted to explain to you. It's a bit of a bucket load, eh? Yeah. Did you guys enjoy it? Yeah. Did you guys find it useful? Would you consider React as a framework that you would use in your next project potentially? Okay, cool. So one last thing I'd like to sort of just mention to you just before I end off is you hear other things out there such as Redux and Mob X, and what are those things? Well, if you can imagine, I'll just go back to this over here very quickly, just so that I can give you something. If you can imagine, right, when we have a large project and it gets really complicated with lots and lots of different nodes as children, you can imagine that if I update something here and I want it to reflect over there, right, I can call it back. In other words, I'd have to pass that callback all the way up there and then all the way down there. That's really painful. That's really, really bad. So what Redux does, right, is Redux basically gives me a way to basically take whatever's changed over here outside of this loop and basically just push it back into the top. So Redux is a state management engine where you can subscribe to various different properties that are happening in your store or in the local cache, okay? And the actual components themselves knows what they're interested in and they will update directly. Should you go ahead and learn Redux? Well, it's worthwhile looking at those videos because it's probably one of the best tuitions. They're free on egghead.io, by the way. If you go to egghead.io and you look at Redux, they're free. And they're really good. But should you learn it? Yeah, you should look at the videos. But, right, the next version of React 16.3, is going to come out with a new state management tool that's going to be built in. Okay? It's called the API context. There is already a context in there, but it's not really good, and they've been sort of experimenting with it. Now, this is the way forward. So essentially, React 16.3 has got some really funky features in it. Not only that, it's also got things like network fetching, which is basically going to be asynchronous and renders async and all sorts of other interesting stuff. So yeah, it's pretty exciting, okay? But what's really nice is that the core of it, things like passing props and states and the fact that you could just render this JavaScript directly in your objects, that all still will remain the same. All right, cool. Any questions? Yes?
So you used TypeScript in that example.
I did.
A lot of people I know, their whole argument was, I'm going to use React because of using JavaScript.
I know.
Did you consider the two? And
well, the thing is that from the onset, I was using React with TypeScript because we were using Angular, and it wasn't really working for us, but the one thing that was working for us was typing. So, hell, why not? And there's a lot of support for it. As you can see, it really works well. You get your object, you basically say, this is the definition of my state, this is the definition of my props, and off you go. Yeah. Any other questions? No? All right, well, thank you for your attention. I appreciate it. Nice.